I am so happy and excited to sit here with Carol Gilligan, who's been a teacher, friend, mentor for a long time. First of all, Carol, thank you for joining me on Think About It.
Well, thank you for inviting me to talk about Scarlet Letter.
It's thrilling to talk to you about Nathaniel Hawthorne's romance. I read this book like most people probably who are not currently in high school.
Do you know I've been told the third most read book in American high schools.
Which is an interesting question. What do you think they want to teach the students with this book?
Well, I know what I was taught in high school, which is this is a book about the wages of sin.
And about the price you have to pay for doing the wrong thing.
Yeah. It's about the wages of sin and
And that's all I remembered. I honestly remembered.
That's right.
I remember two things.
Tragic love.
And it was written in 1850. I was a bit confused, to be honest, in high school. It's 1850, but it's set in 1640.
Right.
And I thought, is he one of those Puritan settlers in Bay Colony? And actually, the book is a historical novel already when it's written.
And, there's so many interesting things about this book. What I have to tell you is much later in my life, when I was in the midst of doing my research with girls, a cousin of one of my daughters-in-law said to me, Carol, have you read Scarlet Letter? And I thought, yeah, the wages of sin,
Right.
Tragic love story. And she said, no, have you read Scarlet Letter? She said, you have to go back and reread it. And I went back and I read a novel that I hadn't seen. And I thought, really, right now, I think this is the American novel. And, the American novel because it deals with, two just quintessentially American themes. One is the tension between the ideal of American democracy, this shining city on a hill. And do you know the word patriarchy is all through this novel? Patriarchal, deacon, patriarchal. So the tension, the conflict between the vision of the city on the hill and the persistence of patriarchal power and privilege, a great quote from the novel, and also between this vision, this pure vision of God who can be worshipped by anyone, anywhere. In your house, in the forest, in the church. That's why they taught girls to read, because everyone had to read the Bible. This unmediated relationship with God and the persistence of an all-male clerical hierarchy. So these two tensions, which are just... So Hawthorne takes them up. The second thing I find out is Jim, my husband, is giving a talk on stigma. And he looks up the word stigma in the dictionary. And there's a person called Mr. William Prynne. Have you heard of him? Prynne the printer, right?
Right.
Who accuses the Archbishop of Laud of misreading the Bible. And he's tried and he's found guilty of stigmata laudis, of saying something bad about an authority. And they burn the letters S and L into his cheeks. And he, in the boat going to the tower where he's going to be imprisoned, makes up this poem where he turns the S.
But he's turning this sign, this outward sign that's being branded as a sinner, as a criminal, into a matter of pride and revises it.
Well, he calls it stigmata laudis. As opposed to we have to remember
what the sentence is.
Yeah, it's a bad sentence, and just like in the novel, the word adultery is never mentioned.
Right.
And he translated it into sanctum laudum, holy prayers. So, yeah.
To go back to when you said the first time you read it, it was taught as the story of a person who committed a grave sin or crime, Hester Prynne, who's committed adultery. It's then put in front of the public, branded as somebody who has sinned, somehow stays in the community and has to wear this letter throughout her life. And that's what I remember from the high school reading. And she turns this slowly into a badge of pride, which is a very American thing to turn as sort of declaration of your inferior status into something to be proud of. But that's about the lesson you were taught in high school, that as a woman you're supposed to follow the rules, otherwise this is going to happen to you, and it's a kind of cautionary tale. I didn't remember the parts you just said when you reread it, that it has something to do with power, with how society is set up, the promise of democracy. I didn't get that reading in my high school introduction to this.
If you had said to me, do you think the word patriarchy appears in Scarlet Letter, I would say, are you kidding? It's all about how, women and da-da-da. But the thing about Hester Prynne is it's not just that she turns it, it's the community does. And at a certain point midway through, there's a chapter called Another View of Hester, and it says that many people forgot the original signification of the A, and they said it meant able, so strong was Hester Prynne with a woman's strength. And then you start to see everything in the novel is seen twice. And even in the introduction, in that custom house section, Hawthorne, the narrator, the unnamed narrator, says, for the romance writer, midnight is the friend, because midnight in a familiar room shows all the objects so distinctly, but unlike a noon visibility. In other words, you're seeing familiar objects, but you're seeing them in a different light. So here's the A, which you're used to seeing as adultery, and you see that, in fact, it makes her able. And it's explicit in the novel. It's so amazing to realize it's there, and I didn't see it, because it says that because she can't fit into the framework of Puritanism. In Puritanism, you're either a good wife, that's a term from the novel, or you're a witch. Now, she can't be a good wife walking around with this A on her chest, and she can't be a witch, or they would take her daughter away. So she doesn't fit into the framework. The A puts her outside the framework, and if you're outside the framework, you can see the frame.
She becomes the character, and Hawthorne is explicit about that. She sees the world from a different place.
She
stays in this world in a complicated way because the society condemns her to be part of society, but not. She lives in a little cottage outside of the town. She comes in. She starts actually also having a profession because she knows how to embroider things. So she becomes the woman who everyone from the highest to the lowest go to have adornment, ornament, which is in itself a challenge to this Puritan idea of aestheticism.
And she adorns the A with gold thread.
Adorns the A with gold thread, and it becomes a badge of honor in a way for her, or at least a badge of apartness, of being apart.
I would say a badge of freedom.
Of freedom.
Because it puts her outside the frame so she can see the framework.
But this reading, that she's the voice of freedom, that's your latter reading. That's not the first high school reading.
No,
you were not taught this as
because the novel frames it in one way and then shows. And if you start to look, it's like another view of Hester, another view of the minister, another view of this and this and this. And then you have to say also, Hawthorne in 1850, he writes this book in the 6 months after his mother has died. And as a small boy, he saw his mother shamed, by the more aristocratic family of his father who died at the sea in Surrey, so forth. And so you realize in the wake of his mother's death and the emotional turmoil, he says it was the only time he ever avoided his adamant, meaning the critical voice inside him, and the only time he wrote with that kind of freedom. And it's almost like somebody, like in a kind of sudden light, sees something and writes it down. Almost, I have a sense, before he knew what he was writing. So he's also the father of a 6-year-old child. And people have written many things about Pearl in the novel, but to me, and I did this work with girls, she's observed. She's not just imagined, because she is the one person who sees through the hypocrisy of the Puritans.
Let's talk about Pearl for a moment. So Hester Prynne gets convicted, but she's relegated to this kind of margin of society. She lives in the town. The town slowly gets used to her. She refuses to divulge the name of the man whose child she now has and raises by herself. Her husband plays an important role there. He disguises as a doctor and becomes this manipulative, very terrifying figure. Pearl is the voice of what then? It's really interesting. She's this impish child, doesn't quite have a complete connection to the reality she lives in, it seems, and signals something else about this world. And I'm interested, she's the kind of supernatural dimension that American literature has always had, this Gothic, from Edgar Allan Poe to Toni Morrison and Stephen King. We've always had this strain of the fantastic. But so Pearl is, you said, real, not just made up, observed.
I mean, I think everything you say is true, and I would say she's also the child of nature. That in a sense she's put outside. And, with Hester, it's her pregnancy that convicts her.
Which is the evidence of her, because her husband hasn't been around for 2 years,
that's
so
right.
she must
so she
she's
had
pregnant.
Sex.
Yeah, so she had sex and she has a baby now, and so she has this baby. She has a baby in prison, and for the first time, and then when the novel opens, she steps into the sunlight with this infant in her arms.
Exactly.
Exposed to the township, which is, first of all, several women. We hear several women commenting on her. And can you say a little bit about she steps into the space and the women have strong opinions
Well,
on
what the
her?
women say, it's like the story of William Prynne. They should have branded these letters. I mean, when you think of the S and the L from the story of William Prynne, and we have to look up what they mean because for some reason, anyway, that she steps out and the women say they should have branded these letters on her cheeks. And the S and L, they are Scarlet Letter.
Right.
You know?
Interesting. Oh, okay, so there's a precedent.
And many of the names in this novel are historical names. I mean, Reverend Wilson was the Reverend Governor. He was the governor.
The Bay Colony. So there's actual historical precedent.
There's
Hawthorne
totally,
himself had an ancestor who was involved in the Salem witch trials, which he learned about, and Hawthorne distanced himself from this person. When the women see Hester Prynne for the first time, she steps out with this beauty and intimidating kind of grace that she actually has, sort of this upright bearing, stands there.
Do you know she's the only one called woman? All the other women are called good wives. But go on.
And their response, I'm trying to remember when I was a high school student, they condemn her, judge her, demean her. There's one woman the youngest one, who probably has some sympathy, but everybody else is very harsh. So as a readers, when we're reading the book, we are in the audience meeting this character for the first time. I think there's a bit of, when high school students read it, you think she did something wrong. She must be punished.
Oh, yeah, totally.
And the women are not on her side. They're not saying, oh, there's a woman being wrongly convicted and society's harsh. They're saying, well, she committed a crime. So I think he sets us up a little bit in this audience, introducing his main characters. And we as readers are not ready yet to see the voice or the symbol of freedom.
I would say I totally agree that he sets us up and then he undercuts it, because she walks around and she says she walks around and she's surprised because women seem to recognize it. And then people seek her out and tell them her secrets and everything else. And so, I mean, it really gets the doubleness of this. And here's the story the way you're supposed to see it. And now look at it in this light. And suddenly you're seeing a very different story here. I mean, to what extent Hawthorne actually deliberately did this, but that is certainly what he did.
There's a doubleness, and it's a complicated doubleness, because she's in a position to say something and to see something about her own society that's given to her only by being ostracized.
Exactly. So, and we know this, that you cannot see a framework if you're in the framework. It's just the way of seeing. But the minute it's like why we say it's important, to travel to another country, to be in another culture, because it's like saying a fish doesn't know it's swimming in water until it's a fish out of water. And so the minute that her pregnancy reveals that she has done something which in terms of that community is great sin and should be punished and everything else, meanwhile the guy goes completely free because he's not pregnant and you can't tell who he is except, of course, the child. The minute that happens, she's put outside by virtue of nature. And I think nature plays a huge role in this novel. And there's a beautiful passage about 2/3 of the way through that says love is a force of nature. And wherever you have that, it brings sunshine and brings life. So you have basically, I think you could say this is a novel about the struggle between love and patriarchy. Mm-hmm. And at the end, Hester Prynne, when she goes back, and that's an interesting question, why does she go back? She frees her daughter. She takes her daughter out. She tries to free Dimmesdale, her lover, and he starts to go, and then he gets scared, and he goes back into the sort of whole puritanical, I've sinned, I've done this terrible thing, I'm the worst person in the world, and he dies.
Right.
She leaves, and then she goes back. And I think she goes back to take up, this is at least my reading, Dimmesdale's failed mission. And she ministers to the people in the community. She goes back into her cottage by the thing, and people come to her, they say, women especially, with dilemmas about love. And she says to them of her firm belief that when the world has grown ripe for it, now you have to think, that's 1850 he's writing, this is 1640, we're now 2018. When the world has grown ripe for it, a new truth will be revealed in order to establish the whole relation between man and woman on a surer ground of mutual happiness. And you think, wait a minute. What Hawthorne is saying is you cannot realize the political vision of a true democracy or this religious vision of an unmediated relationship with God, without also dealing with this relationship between man and woman.
So the idea of a democracy here is an honest, truthful, new relation between men and women, among men and women. And
Among everybody, yeah.
And then among everybody, among men and men, and women and women.
But you can't have this inequality in personal life and have this vision of a shining city on a hill in political life. And she says midway through the novel, in this chapter called Another View of Hester, I mean, this is Hawthorne signaling you. You know, it's like at the end, there's this discussion. Some people were there and they said there's an A on Dimmesdale chest, and other people were there and they saw the same thing and they said there's no A. And Hawthorne won't resolve it. What he says, though, is that if you're living in this kind of lie, after a while you lose your sense of what's real and what's not real, and what's true and what's not true.
The book starts in the Bay Colony, so this is people getting out of England under this absolutist rule that the monarch rules and determines everything. So there's a sense of hope, a sense of establishing a new society. And what you're saying is what doesn't get broken with, although there's a sentence in the book, she breaks the broken chain, she leaves that behind. So Hester Prynne, there's a hope that this society will be more free, that it will actually lead to something like a democracy. We're far from it in 1640. You're saying patriarchy persists even in this new model. And Hester Prynne may be a way to say, unless we break with the...
Well, she says it. I mean, first of all, I have to tell you, because I always think it's unfortunate that I'm talking about this because the word patriarchy is a word I use. It's Hawthorne who uses the word patriarchy, like right at the beginning. He says this patriarchal personage, this is in the introduction,
Right.
You know, in one respect, so august, so impressive, and in another, a total nonentity. So it's like you can see this one way and then you can see it another. So Hester Prynne says midway through the novel, men of the sword have overthrown nobles and kings. This is because they beheaded Charles II. Men, philosophers have in the realm of theory. But, she says, you know, for women to have a fair and equal place in the new society, what you were just talked about, the essential nature, she says, of the opposite sex, and then you think, wait a minute, this is 1850, because Hawthorne sounds like a post-structuralist, or what through long hereditary habit has become like nature will have to be changed, and that of women too. And that's harder than overthrowing nobles and kings. In other words, the psychological change is more daunting than the political change, but you can't have the political change without having the psychological change. This is astonishing.
And this psychological change, what you just said, that culture which starts to appear like nature to us, the conditions of our society which we take for granted because that's how it's always been, this is how we are comfortable. That's why I think those women in the beginning are quite important, because they subscribe exactly to the structures of authority that we would call the patriarchy and completely support it. Although Hester Prynne is a voice within there, because she's ostracized, she's punished, and she accepts her punishment in this glaring way. She's not ashamed and withers away and shrinks away and hides herself. She actually becomes part of the community. It's a very difficult path for her, though. There's a high cost to her freedom. She doesn't get embraced right away. She's mocked, vilified.
Well, and it's a treacherous path because it's constantly threatened with they will take the child away. And then there's a really interesting kind of undertone that I think it stays an undertone, which is at every moment when they push her to the point where they're going to take the child and she says, all right, then I'm going to tell you who the guy is, they pull back. And then you think, wait a minute, they're protecting the guy. They don't want her to say who he is because he's their golden boy. They're grooming him to become the new, Reverend Wilson. Right? Yeah, exactly.
So he's a young minister, and we don't know this for parts of the book. We have a sense there's some strange symmetry between them, and there's some weird affection. And Pearl connects to him right away, intuitively.
And she's the only one. I mean, I really think he's playing with the insistence of the people in the community that Hester raise Pearl as a good Puritan child and so forth. At the same time, Hester is trying to protect this child and protect her kind of what's called her wildness, that is her natural spirit. And she is the only one who sees through the lie. I mean, she sees who Dimmesdale is.
A lot of your work has been with girls and listening to girls, and as you describe in Joining the Resistance and in a Different Voice, part of your own discovery was to listen to girls and hear something you yourself hadn't heard for a while. When you studied first as a psychologist, you were part of the paradigm. You thought this is how human development happens. So Hester has this high tolerance for her daughter Pearl's naturalist, which is this really ungovernable child. She's a wild child in this community, and this mother accepts and tolerates that. And it's not an easy toleration. This child is really you can't really handle at all. Did this connect in a way when you said it's not a made-up figure? It's actually realism.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, that you make the connection because most of us think of Pearl as this little elf and so forth, and then you think, no, she's a girl. you know.
Well,
and
I think
Hawthorne had
she's a girl, and
daughter.
She dresses her up in these incredibly beautiful gowns. She dresses up as a Scarlet Letter. She wears a scarlet gown when she meets the Reverend and the minister. Hawthorne had a daughter too.
Just that age.
I was interested that she is connected to something that then girls will lose or be taught to lose or repress or forget.
Well, I love language in this book, the iron framework of Puritanism, the iron framework of reasoning, that you have to be somehow brought into this framework so you cannot see outside this frame. And then Hester, by virtue of the pregnancy and having this child, says that she doesn't want to lose the child. So she's both inside and outside the framework, which is, from a literary standpoint.
In Scarlet Letter, there's another outside, which is the Native American population, the forest and the Indians. And there's always, what in Hawthorne's language are Indians, they show up, they observe what's going on, and at some point Hester's position is compared to that and said she is as far out of this community as anything that we don't consider part of civilization at that moment in time.
And the Indians use nature, they use herbs as remedies that are healing, and Chillingworth, when he introduces himself into the community, presents himself as a physician with what he learned from the Native Americans.
Her position, Hester's position, Pearl's position, it's at once outside and not outside. And as I just said, Native Americans are considered outside. They come frequently, they trade, they're present. The marine sailors at one of the final scenes, this is foreshadowing, he'll influence Melville to write Moby Dick, that people at sea have their own laws, their own rules. It's out of the bounds of what we consider acceptable behavior. When they come to shore, people tolerate them, are quite afraid of them. So she's outside, but how does someone have a voice that questions the entire setup of society from this outside-inside position?
I mean, I would say that this is, when I say, I think this is arguably the American novel because it takes on that question. And it takes it on, I mean, it's just stunning in the form of this character, this dazzling Hester Prynne. And showing you how she navigates that. And I mean, it's very difficult because at the end, when she has this prophecy, I mean, she's the bringer of the new truth. I mean, it's astonishing. But she says, and then I think Hawthorne, I think of this as the catch-22 of feminism, that Hawthorne says, she says, but the woman who brings the new truth has to be pure and good and so forth. And then you think, he's just shown you something, that the woman who was able, is able by virtue of being adulterated. So in other words, the very thing that enables her,
right.
Disables her.
Right.
So the A is for able and the A is for adulterated, and that's the catch-22 of feminism, because the woman who can see the framework and who can speak about it has to be outside, and by virtue of being outside, in the terms of the framework, she's an impure woman. I think we're living in the midst of that right now.
Impure, not a good woman, not speaking in the right way.
But the good woman can't see the framework because she's completely within the framework. I mean, you could see this recently in the Blasey Ford Kavanaugh hearings. I mean, that was the dilemma for Blasey Ford. To be heard, she had to speak within the framework, but she was to be in the framework.
If you think about that hearing, which was a public spectacle as well, and I mean in the sense of spectacle as a scene of American culture, there was something being staged. It's a stage, it's public, we all observed it. So Blasey Ford had to be on her best behavior, the most proper, never actually even indicate there was emotion in what was clearly a deeply, deeply emotional experience she had to talk about. And then Kavanaugh took the role of being completely overwhelmed and overruled by emotion when he responded.
Exactly.
So you're saying the dilemma of feminism is that women have access to a truth that the system is not quite working for both men and women. It's
Exactly.
not just for women.
Totally.
I think you also say that Hawthorne creates this incredibly fascinating figure of Hester Prynne almost as a distraction from the fact that the relationship between men gets screwed up in patriarchy.
When I saw the names, Uli, Dimsdale and Chillingworth, how does a man of Dale, of nature, become dim? How does a man of worth, Chillingworth, become chilling?
Right.
I thought, in a way, the psychology that Hawthorne is really plumbing here is what happens to men in patriarchy. What happens to, and they're both, we're told over and over again, unusually sensitive, intelligent men. And look what happens to the two of them.
Yeah, they're the leaders of their communities. He's the respected doctor who has knowledge of both the Indian ways of healing, the Western ways of healing. The other one is the minister ready to become reverend of the whole colony, probably one of the most gifted speakers. And Hester is so fascinating to us, but there's a bit of a trap almost laid by Hawthorne. If we only focus on this woman and her role, we don't see how these men are already compromised. He said, and the scene where Dimsdale and Hester Prynne have their encounter, it's in the forest, in nature, in sunlight. There's something there as if it's not dimmed. For a moment, he steps into the light.
That's right. Then you see him in the light, and she says, "Is the world then so narrow? I mean, can we go? There must be some place we can go outside this town where you could really shine." And he says, "Yes," and then he can't do it.
And what is the cost, do you think, to men? This is a much broader question because feminism has often been characterized as it helps women in their role in society, gives them something, and there's a loss of privilege and power for men. This book says men are already compromised and are losing a lot by being invested in the patriarchy.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you take her prophecy at the end, the whole relationship between man and woman will be established on a surer ground for both of mutual happiness. And also the part about what has through long hereditary habit come to seem like the so-called essential nature of man and of women needs to be modified if we're serious about the basic tenets of the Protestant religion, of the Reformed, that we can have as humans access to God's voice within us. We don't need someone to interpret it for us. And also can live in a true democracy, which means everyone has a voice. And, you have to say the American colonies at the beginning, because of these beliefs, they taught girls to read because everyone had to read the Bible. So Hawthorne is saying, for both men and women to realize these really glorious visions of how people can live together, you can't do it if you don't deal with this psychological issue between men and women.
You've written about the fact that this psychological distortion of what happens between men and women under patriarchy is the obstacle to true democracy.
It's the obstacle to love and to true democracy. And in this novel, you see it as both.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right. Well, the weird thing is there is something like love between the couple, between the mother and the child, but they can't express it, or it is obvious and manifest to everybody, but
it
they
can
can't
flourish
talk about
in nature in the woods, and then in the town it has to be
can't.
very, very,
Right.
very constrained.
Right.
I remembered the SNL seditious libel.
Oh, okay, there you go. Yes, okay. Which was outlawed. You couldn't say certain things, right?
Yeah.
So Hawthorne taps into something, this promise and this hope of America, that we can invent a new society, a better one.
Right.
And somehow he puts these characters in front of us. In The Birth of Pleasure, you talk about the fact that some of the stories that we know very well, we have to keep on retelling ourselves because they deal with a trauma, with a kind of repression or break. And the knowledge that's contained or repressed through trauma is not easy to access.
No.
So I was thinking of rereading Scarlet Letter or rereading some of these books that many of us didn't get some part of it. I don't think we failed to understand, but we couldn't get it because we've been trained and habituated to not see certain things. To read a book, it confirms something about America, that some people are in, some people are out. We have to have rules. We have to have laws. It's difficult when women transgress. They must be punished, etc. She's a bit of a renegade character celebrated. But then we put the book away. And when you said stories of trauma get told over and over again, I was quite interested in that the repetition of a story can help us to see something we didn't see the first time.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost as though something in us keeps going back, because even though we don't quite see it. And I mean, that's what, I mean, to me, it's fascinating. I remember when I was in college, I studied perception. And it's fascinating to me how, you know, when you sort of shift the lens, suddenly you see things that are on the page here, and you think, how come I didn't see them before? It's not as though they weren't there. They were there, and I just didn't see them. So I have a feeling that on some level, I mean, I think we speak of it as intuition, or we don't really quite know how to speak about the kind of knowing that we know something without quite knowing that we know it. So we're drawn back to reread this novel again and again. I mean, I would say that's why the novel keeps being read. And then in some ways, because it's such a deeply radical in the sense of really going to the root. I mean, going to the root of, I think, what I would call the American dilemma, which is the tension between this vision of a democratic society and the persistence of patriarchal privilege and power, again, quote from Hawthorne. I mean, this notion of God, it's really almost like a Quaker notion that, you know, that we all have a direct access to God's voice if we just listen. And you don't need someone to tell you, you just need to open yourself to this. And then the persistence of this all-male clerical hierarchy. I mean, you know, we see it right now, and so forth. So I think this is the American dilemma, and here's Hawthorne exploring it. And I would say, so we keep reading this book. Why is this book the third most read book in American schools? I mean, first of all, its language is a little archaic. It's a little dated. How many tragic love stories do you want to read, sort of thing? And yet I think it's a sense of somewhere in this book is something we need to know and to deal with, so we're drawn back to it.
But interesting what you just said. It's something like intuition, or that we know something, but it's not easy to access, which is strange in a way. You would think young people especially searching for things, they should be able to learn how to give expression to themselves in this unmediated way before culture disrupts it. And I think the book is read in two ways. I think on one way, there is a sense there's something in this book, which is a key to American democracy. This knowledge that we have, there could be something about people being truly free to themselves. At the same time, the book also, on the surface, teaches you exactly the opposite. That there's a woman, she'll get punished, she tries to act out a little bit, but ultimately things will settle down and that's it. And
you know, I love what you said before about hovering on the periphery. Is Hester Prynne and Pearl are the Native Americans? I mean, in a sense, they're all here, you know.
And this is when they're trying to work out who's going to be in America, who's going to contribute to this, and what conception do we have of a society of equals, where people would actually be able to contribute their voices. One of the key scenes is when he gives this amazing speech. Dimsdale, the minister, gives this rousing speech on election day when a new governor of the colony is instituted. We never get the speech, but we get the reaction of the crowd.
He's this incredibly charismatic, person.
But it's interesting, it's empty. In the novel, Hawthorne, who could have written the most rousing speech, I mean, the language is such a powerful language in this novel, but it doesn't really matter what he says, but that people believe he says a certain truth.
You know, and then, I mean, to me, it's almost like, footprints through the novel, starting with the introduction where it says this thing about moonlight is the romance writer's friend because moonlight in a familiar room shows you all the familiar objects but in a different light. And then you have another view of Hester, that's one chapter title, another view of the minister, and then the thing at the end, was there an A, was there not? And it's never resolved. I mean, it's like...
And not resolved?
Not resolved.
And I think there's two parts. That's the power of, he called this a romance, what we will call a novel today, that in literature, things don't have to be resolved the way they may be in argument or
right,
discourse.
Exactly.
Although, of course, maybe we can't quite resolve them. I'd be curious what you think, whether this intuition about a knowledge the book ends, what kind of note does it end on? Does it say there is a vision, there is a way for men and women to actually find a new footing?
There is a new truth. I mean, that's literally, it's an enunciation, a new truth, when the world has grown ripe for it. I mean, and I think very much, is this the time? I mean, are we now living in that time where there is a new truth? We've come to a new understanding about ourselves as humans, men, women, across the gender spectrum, we would now say. A new truth that will establish the whole relation, I mean, which is really basically the whole realm of love relationships in human beings, on a sure ground of mutual happiness. Are we living in that? And then is there that we can see it and then we don't see it? So, I mean, I think that sense of we hover between a commitment to one way of seeing things. Life is really tragic. Love never can really work.
And autonomy is paramount. Subjectivity means isolation. To be a moral agent, you have to understand things abstractly. So certain...
And of course, he's a charismatic reverend. And of course, he wouldn't reveal, that he's the father of this child and, and so forth. And then there's right next to it, there's another truth saying, it's right here. It's just right here. Why don't, And at a certain point, she says to this man who's really sick unto death, it's a kind of Kierkegaard sort of moment. She says, release yourself from this, walk into life. And you see his strength comes back, his energy comes back. I mean, it's extraordinary, and he can't do it. So, I mean, I really do think on the deepest level, this novel is a meditation about men, about these two extraordinary men who basically destroy themselves and each other.
Right. There's a part of the story where they're living together ultimately, unbeknownst. One of them doesn't know who the other one really is in his life and what role he plays, and he becomes his doctor, ministers to him. I always thought there was a subplot where he's slowly poisoning him.
Well, and there's a homoerotic subplot, and everybody says this anticipates Freud because he's like the guy's analyst.
Well, I think he slowly poisons him, and he's the analyst, and he extracts some kind of sense of guilt. And unlike an analyst, he actually just wants to deepen it, and he wants to let it eat away with him. Instead of what Hester says to him, he says, come clean, speak out, speak your truth, then you will be not liberated from it, but you will be able to carry that truth.
Exactly.
And Schillingworth said to him, stay with this guilt because it'll eat away with you. He wants to punish him in a way.
Well, because in the old story, you could say the patriarchal story, Dimmesdale has humiliated Schillingworth.
Yes.
I mean, he's taken his woman.
Right.
I mean...
And Schillingworth knows there's a really interesting, complicated conversation between them, between Hester Prynne and him.
When you think of the complicated conversations where they don't follow, the usual script because Schillingworth says, just, I don't want to punish you.
And it's a very strangely honest conversation. He said, I married you probably for the wrong reasons.
Right.
I wanted you to do things for me, to lend me prestige, happiness, something I probably didn't earn with your affection because it wasn't based on mutual recognition of what you wanted.
And what she says, my sin was not the pregnancy. My sin was marrying where there was no love.
That, I thought, was an incredibly radical conversation. And then he also left her in this colony and was in Europe taking care of business for 2 more years, left her alone in a place which was rather
and had no notion
unsafe.
If he was ever coming.
Exactly. So abandoned her and never showed up even when he could have shown up, and then just appears literally out of nowhere.
And says, what, you weren't faithful?
Yeah. And then says, but don't tell anybody I was married to you because I would be humiliated.
Yeah,
so actually the price of the patriarchy for him as well is not to speak his truth.
Well, then it says the price of the patriarchy is it forces him to destroy Dimmesdale.
To take revenge within the rules of the patriarchy.
And it forces Dimmesdale to hide, really, basically, his humanity.
Does Hawthorne give us a sense that men are aware of these costs? I think
Hawthorne's
so.
a man.
And this is actually an interesting question. It's actually a very interesting question because we have debates now in the last 50 years whether men can write women characters, etc., whether you can write across these lines. This is a man who's imagining a woman who knows things about what it means to be a woman in puritanical New England and in Massachusetts in the 1850s. a knowledge that, as we know, most women couldn't really bear to express. So it's this intuition, something in society that is not limited to only women can know it or
Well,
only
but then
men
you
can know
say
it.
also, I mean, when you go and you fill in the history, that Hawthorne, he's a 4 or 5-year-old boy, and he's watching his mother scorned by his father's more aristocratic family for not being of the same aristocratic social class. So she takes Nathaniel and his sisters and goes and raises them with her Manning family. And then when he goes to Bowdoin College, he wants his mother to come and be there. And when he's practicing to be a writer, he lives in the attic of her house for 12 years. And he has 2 sisters, and his sister-in-law
Right.
is Elizabeth Peabody, who's the feminist. And she
And an abolitionist,
drags
a
him
feminist,
to these. And Hawthorne is known for being quoted as making racist and also sexist statements. And you feel like here's an underside of him that gets shown. I really have this sense of like there's a kind of sudden moonlight illumination, like a blinding thing, and suddenly he sees something and he writes it, and he'll never write it again.
But that's interesting that someone could see something that doesn't correspond with all parts of his personality and public character. If he made racist, sexist statements today, we would condemn that. We should condemn that. But still, he sees something for a moment.
Yes, that's my sense of this novel. It's like something written in a flash of lightning.
Right. And he can access a truth that is a little bit beyond him.
Which is why, to me, this novel stands out among all of his work. And it's interesting to me, too, that in a way its light is hidden by reading it as a novel about sin and then the wages of sin and romantic, tragic love and so forth. And that's very comfortable for us. And then suddenly...
Comfortable in what sense? You've written in The Birth of Pleasure about the fact that tragic love stories are the ones we keep on telling ourselves as if they are inevitable.
Well, because in a way it keeps us from having to take the risk.
Of?
Well, first of all, the risk of love, which is always a risk, but also the risk of when she says, for this vision of how we could live together to be realized, we have to change what we have come to accept as the essential nature of both men and women. And there's a certain comfort in that. It's a bad story, it's a sad story, but it's a story we know. And, it's a much more open story. If you actually, suppose you wrote the story, somebody could come along and do this. Of actually, Dimmesdale decides to leave with Hester.
Well, I think that's a part where Hawthorne also shies away with something. He says, we don't have another model yet. Going back to the old world, going back to some village in England and kind of hiding out in anonymity, that's not open to them.
No.
She tries it and she returns. Hawthorne thinking, it's still the only option. We have to try something new. Mm-hmm. They reject the old world, the old ways. There's nothing to go back to, but we don't know how to step into the future right now.
But wouldn't you say, that's the current dilemma?
Where do we turn? Some ways, and in some ways, I think what you said earlier, how it connects to our current moment, why are we still trapped in a tragic story of love and a story of inauthenticity that we can't face certain truth? And going back doesn't seem to be an option. There's no going back in America in any case. There's nowhere to turn to, I think, to return to a past that was better for whom?
Yeah, right.
For
right,
what? For
yeah,
what?
Right.
Was it better?
Yeah, we see the problems with that. And the same on the other, this huge challenge of envisioning taking a new truth and really trying to live it.
Can you say something about how in your own work, and I'm really interested, I asked this already earlier, when you started listening to girls and you had to unlearn to hear certain things and you had to hear something else. How did that happen?
I can remember the moment. I really, honestly, because it was, my association is to Proust, where he tastes the Madeleine dipped in tea, and suddenly, as he says, it opened a vast storehouse of recollection. And I was standing in a school gym with a group of 6th graders. And one of them, their teacher, who was beloved, he was a guy, walks through the gym. They were spending this week with the girls doing writing and theater work with girls. And she just calls out to the teacher, yells at him because she's so angry because he's spending the week with the boys and they want to spend the week with the teacher too. And it was like the voice just almost kinesthetically went through me, and I thought, I know that voice. It's the voice that speaks without instant second thoughts and revisions. You know, where you just feel something and you just say it, and then you say the next thought. And I thought it was so familiar, and it was also so surprising that somebody could do that. I mean, she just said what she felt to him. And I thought, wait a minute, that was my voice.
Your own voice.
Yeah, I mean, I recognized it, and I thought, whoa, what happened to that voice? And now with women, with men, but starting with women, I'm always listening for that voice.
And in this scene, if I'm imagining the gym where a group of girls are saying to the male teacher, we have every right and deserve to also be in the class with you right now.
Exactly.
In some ways, so she's actually saying the way it's set up, it's not fair and equal.
Right.
But it wasn't a political critique of the way the school is set up. But she said, we like you as a teacher. We want you as a teacher.
And we're mad because you're not with us. I mean, it was just that.
I think there's a lot that says something in this voice. There's a kind of, we're thirsty and hungry for knowledge. We want to listen to you as well.
Right.
We shouldn't be in a different category here.
That's right. Yeah.
And so what voice did you remember from yourself?
Well, it was more the sense of the voice that just speaks what you're thinking and feeling. And then, I mean, I hear it now with my students. But the student, she was the valedictorian of her high school class, so she's one of these, you know, kind of the girls who are held up as the girl who has everything and going to a great college and has a lot of friends. She says, if I were to say what I was feeling and thinking, no one would want to be with me, my voice would be too loud. So it's a voice that I, and I think many other women, learn to hear as, and then just the word too is key. Too loud, too angry, too honest, too, you know. And as people would say to girls, I started going around with girls, and I was amazed at how in the course of a day they were told over and over and over again, shh, don't say that. People won't appreciate it if you say that. And the rewards, the inducements held out to them to say what people wanted them to say instead of saying what they were actually thinking and feeling. And then, you know, when people write about the sense of inauthenticity and the modern dilemma and so forth, you think, wait a minute, that's built into this.
The rewards are what?
You have a lot of friends. You're the kind of girl that everybody wants to be with. You get the right answer in school. You get A's. You get into Harvard. You know, it's endless. I mean, actually, it's a wonderful scene in The Tempest in Shakespeare, where Miranda, the daughter of Prospero, he puts her to sleep. He says, "Here, cease more questions. 'Tis a good dullness," he says. And then goddesses come and they offer her honor, riches, marriage, blessing. And I thought, that's it. You want honor, riches, marriage, blessing? Shut up. You know. And what's the opposite? Dishonor, to live in poverty, to be all alone, and to be cursed. And I mean, I think the deal that's offered to women in patriarchy is, look, if that's what you want, you can have it.
But it's interesting. Hester Prynne has two deals in front of her. One is to not say anything, so she got married to a man she didn't love. That was inauthentic, untrue. She knew that. And the other one was to express a love that was forbidden, which is to the minister. So in some way she says to herself, if I speak out on the first one, I'm going to go back into a marriage that was loveless and inauthentic, so that's not the truth. If I speak out on the second one, I'm going to expose him to the same punishment. That's not the truth in the society. So she somehow manages to still express it through the letter, through her behavior, and becomes this figure in the community who embodies the truth. And as you said, other women start talking with her, usually in the dark of night when she goes and ministers to the poor, the afflicted, people dying, people being sick. They all talk to her. And then in the noonday of the brightness of the sunshine, they don't acknowledge her.
Right.
So she is the voice of a truth that all women have and all men have, but don't dare to speak.
Yeah. And then you say, why are we still reading this novel? Because on some level, we sense this. There's something in this novel that is speaking to us. And that line that you said is so extraordinary, where she says, you know, my worst sin was marrying where I felt no love. You think, whoa.
Well, in 1850, he writes this when Engels, a few years later, has an analysis of marriage and writes this incredibly powerful feminist text and says marriage is about managing property relations and property for men, keeping women out of possession.
Right.
So you'll have an entire tradition that taps into a knowledge and then also covers it up. And as you said, Hester Prynne is this figure for Hawthorne, and then he has the stroke of genius to say, but it also causes her to be ostracized immediately. So he reveals a double truth, not just there is a truth, there's an intuition, but it is so costly that society does everything to actually suppress it.
And we buy into the suppressed story initially. I mean, that's how I read it initially. It's how you read it.
Which is a very strange thing that the text is taught as if it was Hawthorne being a Puritan.
You know, and honestly, if you're an English teacher and you see another view of Hester, another view of, you think you should look for the doubling here.
Well, I think the next question would be an English teacher, and anybody can discover, okay, there are two opinions, two versions, but the cost is very high to accept the second one. It's an open-ended one.
But you would have to say the cost is very high to accept either one.
Oh, interesting, because I just got the cost is not so high because it's familiar, it's stable, everybody knows how to behave.
It turns Mr. Dale into Mr. Dimsdale and Mr. Worth into Mr. Chillingworth.
Right.
And it makes Hester all alone at the end.
She loses her connection.
She has this profound connection to the people who come and talk to her.
Right.
But she's still living on the outskirts, and you notice she willingly puts back on her gray dress and the Scarlet A because she doesn't want to be inside. I mean, it says the Scarlet A was her passport into regions that other women would not tread. I mean, this is not, it doesn't take a genius to see this.
Right.
But it's so interesting about how we read past that.
Well, and the story that she refuses to give up her daughter. And they want to take her daughter away repeatedly, as you said. She threatens to expose the whole hypocrisy of the society that protects men in these positions. And that she's raising a daughter. I think Pearl is just a fascinating character. And I know people who just say, oh, she's just the worst and just unruly, this incredibly outrageous voice in the book. And I thought, she is the reminder that there's something else in life, that there's something else in society.
And the dilemma of any parent, because Hester says, how can I she has the spirit of uncommon womanhood or something like this. It's remarkable. And an eye for the truth, she says. And yet she's got to keep her within certain bounds or they're going to take this child away.
And there's a very powerful scene when Pearl keeps on asking, what does the letter A stand for?
And Hester lies to her.
And Hester lies and says, I cannot share this with you. I'll lock thee in the dark closet if you ask whether you bother me or tease me again. And there's a moment when Hester removes the A, there's a moment of opening of hope, and we think, oh, this could resolve the whole problem of the novel. And the girl refuses to recognize her mother.
Yeah.
Says, you're not you don't, and will not come to her until she reattaches the A. So it's as if Pearl sees your identity is the fact that you're outside of this society.
And you're sad.
Yes.
I mean, that's really, really interesting, isn't it?
That she recognizes her mother's...
In her sadness.
In her sadness. You've written quite a bit about this, about children who recognize that their parents have two voices. There's a boy in one of your studies who says, Mommy has a happy voice, but also she has a sad voice sometimes.
Yeah.
And then the mother says, well, I don't want to share my sad voice with him because I'll burden him. I think that's a dilemma for all people in all relationships. Not just parents to say,
right.
Can I share with you my...
But if you say we all as humans start out with an ear for the whole range of human voices, for the happy voice, for the sad voice that we pick up. And little children, I mean, they don't have, a lot of concepts, but they pick up emotionally what's going on. And, in a world where you're not supposed to pick up some of what's going on, then that's a dilemma because you have to teach your child not to know what they know or not to say. And
do you think that's a greater dilemma for parents raising girls or boys?
No,
or
I think it's
the same.
Different dilemma.
Different, but
an equal dilemma. Let me put it that way, because you know what's going to happen. I mean,
I think this is a question for democracy of how do you raise children and people into acknowledging that there's a truth that they know that society doesn't want them to know.
And you could say that in its deepest intention, democracy depends on that kind of knowing. I mean, Hannah Arendt is the one who kept emphasizing. You can't have people representing other people because everybody's voice has to be able to be heard. You have to create the public arena where everyone can come and speak. And it's in that sort of mix of voices and in all the cacophony. I mean, you could say in a way now we're trying to do that with really being sensitive to whose voices haven't been heard and still aren't being heard and so forth. Because to have a functioning democracy, for everyone to buy in, that's what has to happen. But it's a real challenge then.
Did you think your own work, by listening to those voices, which was revolutionized and really rethought the paradigm of human development, did you connect it as readily to democracy and to political?
That was a late thing. And I'll tell you, I mean, it was really part of why when I left Harvard and came to NYU, at Harvard, I mean, I had been doing this research, first with girls and then with young boys and then with couples and so forth. And I kept coming up against this resistance on the part of girls to something. And it was resisting something that it felt really like it was real. It wasn't just resisting your mother or resisting da-da-da. And then I was here visiting at NYU initially, and I was visiting in this visiting fellowship for non-lawyers that was held at the law school. So suddenly I was up against the normative ethical framework of a law school. And that was the first time I used the word patriarchy. And I said, wait a minute, what they are resisting is this force which, in the name of gender is splitting human capacities into, really undermining them by either you could think or you could feel, but you couldn't both think and feel, that kind of thing. You could have a self or you could have relationships. You couldn't have both. And then I realized that's when I saw that what I had as a psychologist thought about as the requisites for love were also the requisites for living in a democratic society. That was fascinating to me.
And to recognize what you just said, that under the name or rubric of gender, we deny ourselves a certain authenticity in relationships.
As humanity, yes, exactly.
As humanity.
And the power of gender, because, the way in which gender is used to shame people. You're not a real man, you're not a good woman. And so therefore you start to hide or shield or distance yourself or dissociate yourself from really vital parts of what is part of our human nature.
That sentence sounded like a direct description of the Scarlet Letter.
Yeah.
How to be a good woman or a respectable man, these categories, which are what we call classical gender categories, deny and suppress what would be an authentic relationship, which is essential to democracy among equals, people whose voices matter.
It's essential for love. It's essential for democracy. And then you think, Hawthorne, in this one novel, you can't be a woman, a human being, and a good wife. You know what I mean?
Right.
And then this playing, I'm sure he must have heard it, because how could a writer not hear it? Dimmesdale, Chillingworth.
Right.
You can't be a man of worth and be in this patriarchal structure without becoming chilling or without becoming dim. And so he's really seeing the cost.
When you teach your work, when you teach the Scarlet Letter, I have read this book for so long and think this is a woman's story, and it's about a woman's search for some role in society that's not compromised. And I didn't read it the way you've just taught me to read it, as much about it compromises men tremendously, and there's a huge cost in patriarchy to men. So when I'm teaching it, I think the women would pick this part of the story up maybe more easily. Our second reading, how this is a story of someone speaking a truth or having access to a truth that challenges the whole system. And that men would pick that up later or with more difficulty, because we as men stay very invested in our privilege and power and think it's good for us. I have stability. I know what I'm doing.
And you're certainly taught to think that.
Yes, exactly.
But I'll tell you what really led me to do that is that I was invited by Tina Packer to turn the novel into a play. So I then had to start to write characters. On stage, of these characters. And what I realized very soon is that the psychology that Hawthorne really explores is the psychology of Dimmesdale and Chillingworth. More than the psychology of Hester. And it still took me a while to say, wait a minute, is Hester, and I don't mean this in a superficial way, is she something of a decoy? She's so dazzling. you can't take your eyes off her. And he describes her that way with her hair and the gold thread and everything else. Meanwhile, over here, he's doing something. He's exploring the psychology of two men. I mean, he goes to such lengths to tell you these are the most sensitive, the most intelligent men. And one is behaving like a bit of a dimwit, and the other is like turning into a devil,
Right.
But he won't let you stay there because this is a man of worth. Because Chillingworth before, when he was Roger Prynne in Amsterdam, I always think of him as like Jimmy Carter. I mean, he's building homes for the poor, you know what I mean? Like Habitat for Humanity.
Right.
And doing good. And she admired that in him. But it's not the man you fall in love with.
Right.
And then she sees and then he tells you with Dimmesdale, I mean, he has the whole town just wrapped in this sermon. And
but I think that's a great way of thinking of approaching the book. If you think of these three characters and how they would speak, I think as a man, I immediately realize if I spoke in one of those two voices, it's such a compromised voice. You're either a devil or a dimwit. You somehow are not in touch.
Right.
You're a horrible person and you're living in a lie, or you're a sad, tragic person living in a lie, but you're living in a lie.
Either way, you're living in a lie. Both of them. And in case, Hawthorne is so funny here because in case you miss the point, he describes Dimmesdale as a man who loves the truth and is living a lie.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
there's your, what is it, Cliff Note sentence. I mean,
Well, and it's important, as you said, it's a Cliff Note sentence, but Cliff Note sometimes gets to the truth of things.
yeah, right.
This is a critically important American book.
And then you read in there that her Scarlet Letter was her passport into regions that other women would not tread.
Right. And this is 1850, before the country will enter some 10 years later into a civil war over one of the fundamental questions of our society, how to live together as equals. Hawthorne is part of this whole debate in the 1850s. He's friends with Emerson. He's friends with Whitman. He becomes
And
Margaret
his sister-in-law
Fuller, Elizabeth.
is the abolitionist feminist.
So these ideas are around him, but he's probably, as you said, more in tune because of what he witnessed, both when he was a young child, what happened to his mother, who's ostracized and told to stay in her station, and she's not quite of the same level.
He's seen a woman shamed, yeah.
And then he sees her die. And I think this trauma of seeing her suffer tremendously and not being able to help her twice. He's a young boy, he can't help her because she's the mother. And then when she dies, he also can't help her. She dies of cancer, he can't do anything. So in some ways, I wonder whether even Chillingworth as a doctor, there's a sense of helplessness, but it happens twice. Once it's social, once it's biological or through medicine. And that this trauma is something that allows him to see something for a moment that then gets put into this book. And that men can't really see as easily otherwise. And you said Hawthorne probably
And that after this book, he doesn't see.
He doesn't see it anymore.
No.
Right.
I mean, I feel like this book is like a moment.
Right.
But we have it.
Yeah, we were in touch with it, and we have what books can do. They can teach us how to start listening. Sometimes you're struck in a gym, you hear a girl's voice, and you think, this is my voice.
Yeah.
Sometimes you read a book and you think, this is Nathaniel Hawthorne in 1850, but there's a sentence in this book, this is my voice.
Right.
How can that be?
Right.
I find that always very striking about books, that they resonate with something in ourselves that we didn't quite know.
Yeah.
I want to thank you. What are you writing next, Carol? So
I'm finishing a novel, a second novel.
That's fantastic.
Yeah,
So I'm excited about that. And
Oh, thank you.
I really want to thank you about this conversation about the Scarlet Letter, titled The Scarlet Letter, and not Hester Prynne, A Fallen Woman, which would have been the convention of the time. That's actually what
Although The Scarlet Letter, I mean, in its conventional interpretation, is about a novel about a fallen woman.
Right. But he didn't give it that title, so he somehow wanted to maybe stick
And that moment where it says, many people forgot the original signification of the Scarlet Letter. They said it meant able. So strong was Hester Prynne with a woman's strength. And then later there's this, some people see this A in the sky and they say it means angel. And, it's like A means everything,
Right.
except the word adultery, which never appears in the novel. And then you think of seditious libel, which this old William Prynne, who was one of the, you'd be interested, Uli, because he was one of the initial free speech people.
Right.
I mean, and he says it means, holy prayers, not seditious libel, and it means stigmata laudis, the stigma of the archbishop. And this sense of, you look at things one way and they seem to have one meaning, and then you look at them another way and it has a completely different meaning.
And the second way of looking at it is not just another meaning in the same context, but the entire context has to shift.
Yeah, exactly. And